The call came through on every frequency at once. I was halfway inside a busted coolant relay on Deck 4 when the speakers crackled, the lights flickered, and every screen aboard my ship lit up with the same transmission. I knocked my head on the panel crawling out, swore quietly, and stood there with grease on my hands, staring at the main display. The message was not in any language I recognized. Then it was in all of them, shifting like water finding its level, until finally it settled into English, clean and precise, like something that had practiced the words 10,000 times before speaking them. People of Earth, we are the Galactic Council. You are not alone. You never were. We are reaching out now because you have crossed a threshold. You have left your world in sufficient numbers that you can no longer be ignored. This is not an invitation. This is a notification. A representative will arrive at coordinates transmitted alongside this message in 72 hours. Be present. Be cooperative. The future of your species depends on your ability to listen. That was it. No music. No fanfare. No dramatic pause. Just 43 words in English, and then silence. And then the hum of my ship filling the gap like it always did. My name is Mara Halverson. I fly a mid-range cargo hauler called the Lena Gray, named after my grandmother who once drove a truck across 3 countries without a map and considered that perfectly normal. The Lena Gray is not a military vessel. She is not a research ship. She carries machine parts, food supplies, medical equipment, and occasionally the personal belongings of colonists who have decided that asteroid mining sounds like a reasonable career. I have been doing this for 11 years. I am good at it. I am not, by any definition of the word, a diplomat. And yet I was 40,000 kilometers from the coordinates in question when the message arrived, which meant I was the closest human vessel to the designated meeting point by a margin of several hours. Fleet Command reached me before I even had time to turn the ship around. Halverson. The voice on the line belonged to Admiral Luis Escobar, a man I had met exactly twice before, both times briefly, both times in circumstances that suggested the universe had a poor sense of humor. He had the kind of voice that did not rise or fall regardless of what he was saying. He could have been reading a grocery list. You're the closest we've got. Hold position at those coordinates. Do not approach whatever shows up. Do not transmit anything except standard ID pulses. You are a witness, not a participant. Understood? Understood, I said, which was true. I understood what he was asking. I was not sure I understood what was happening to the entire human race in the next 72 hours, but I understood his instructions. Good. A diplomatic team will reach you in 60 hours. You'll have backup before anything arrives. He disconnected before I could ask whether backup meant anything useful against a civilization that had apparently been watching us long enough to know we were ready to be notified. I turned the Lena Gray toward the coordinates and set her to low thrust. Then I sat down in the pilot's seat, pulled up everything in our database about first contact scenarios, and spent the next 4 hours reading theories that had been written by people who had no idea this day would actually come. Some of them were hopeful. Most were cautious. A few were written by people who had clearly spent too much time alone with their thoughts. None of them were written by a cargo hauler from Portland who smelled faintly of coolant fluid and had a half-eaten sandwich on the console beside her. The hours passed the way hours do when you are waiting for something enormous. Slowly, and then all at once. My crew was small. 3 people, not counting me. Owen Lark, my engineer, was a quiet man from Bristol who had been in space for so long that he seemed faintly surprised whenever he remembered that planets existed. He came to the cockpit within an hour of the message, sat down in the co-pilot chair, and did not say anything for a long time. Then he said, "Well," and went back to his work. That was Owen's way of processing the end of human solitude in the universe. Nina Farrow, my navigator, was 26 years old, and had the habit of narrating things as they happened, as if she were recording them for someone who was not in the room. She came in talking and did not stop for most of the first day. She talked about the message, about what 47 civilizations might look like, about whether they ate food or absorbed light or something else entirely, about whether they had music, about whether they had found us charming or frightening or simply inconvenient. I let her talk. It was better than the silence. Pete Caro, my cargo hand, slept for 14 of the first 24 hours, which was his response to almost everything unusual. When he woke up, he made coffee, came to the cockpit, looked at the empty coordinates on the scanner, and said, "Nothing yet?" And when I said no, he nodded and went back to make more coffee. Pete was a practical man. The diplomatic team arrived in 58 hours, 2 hours early, aboard a sleek government vessel called the Accord's Edge that made my ship look like a delivery crate by comparison. There were 6 diplomats, 3 military observers, and 1 woman named Dr. Clara Osei, who was introduced to me as a xenolinguistics specialist, and who immediately asked if she could borrow my coffee maker, because hers had broken during transit. I lent her the coffee maker. Fleet Admiral Escobar arrived on a separate ship 4 hours after the diplomats, which told me something about how much trust he placed in the diplomatic process. He came aboard the Lena Gray briefly, shook my hand, looked around my cockpit, and then looked at me with the expression of a man who had long since stopped being surprised by what the universe threw at him. "You holding up?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "Good. Stay that way." He paused, looking at the forward display, at the empty coordinates sitting there on the scanner, like a marked spot on a map. 47 civilizations, he said, almost to himself. "You know what that means? It means 47 species looked up at the stars and said, 'Those lights are interesting, let me go see what they are.' And they found each other, and they built something." He was quiet for a moment, "and then they found us." "Is that good or bad?" I asked. He looked at me. "I have absolutely no idea," he said, and then he smiled, just slightly, in the way that told me he was not entirely unhappy about not knowing. The arrival happened at exactly the 72-hour mark. Not approximately. Not within a few minutes. Exactly. One moment the coordinates were empty. The next moment, they were not. The ship that appeared was large. Not aggressively large. Not the kind of large that was meant to intimidate, but the kind of large that simply was, the way a mountain is large, without apology or announcement. It was dark-colored, smooth-surfaced, and entirely silent. No engine sounds reached us, though we were within range to hear them if they existed. No running lights, no standard navigation signals, nothing that our instruments expected to find on a vessel of that size. It simply sat there in the dark between stars, patient as stone. Every screen on the Lena Gray updated simultaneously. The transmission that came through was audio only, which surprised me. I had expected visuals. Instead, there was a voice, carefully modulated, almost but not quite human in cadence, the way a sentence sounds when someone has learned a language from recordings rather than from people. "We are glad you are present," the voice said. "We will send a representative in a smaller vessel to facilitate initial contact. Please do not be alarmed. This has been done 46 times before. It will be brief." I looked at Admiral Escobar, who was standing beside me at the display. 46 times before, Nina said softly from her station. "They've done this 46 times, Pete said from the back. "And this is number 47. He paused. "We are number 47. Nobody said anything after that. We all just watched the scanner as a smaller shape detached from the large vessel and moved toward us. Steady, unhurried, certain of its welcome in a way that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Not from fear exactly, but from the very specific feeling of understanding, for the first time, that something enormous had already begun, and no one had asked us whether we were ready. I looked at my hands. They were steady. I was glad about that. The smaller vessel docked with the Accord's Edge rather than with us, which made sense. We were a cargo ship. But Admiral Escobar stayed on the Lena Gray, and the feed from the diplomatic vessel came through to our screens in real time. We watched as an airlock opened. We watched as Dr. Osei and the lead diplomat, a man named Colin Farrer who had spent 30 years in international negotiations and had the permanent expression of someone expecting bad news delivered politely, walked forward to meet whatever came through. What came through was tall, and very still, and it moved with a kind of careful deliberateness that suggested it was aware of exactly how much space it occupied and was choosing not to use any more than necessary. It was not like anything I had seen before, but it was not frightening either. It was, in the way of many things that are genuinely alien, simply itself, without any pretense of being something more familiar. The council representative stopped at a respectful distance. It looked at Colin Farrer. It looked at Dr. Osei. Then it spoke, and Dr. Osei listened, and the translator she wore at her collar began to work. "We welcome humanity to the community of spacefaring peoples. it said. "We are here to explain what that means. We are also here to deliver the terms of integration. They are not difficult. Other species have found them acceptable. We believe you will as well." Colin Farrer, to his credit, nodded calmly. But I was watching Admiral Escobar beside me. He had not moved. His arms were folded, his eyes were on the screen, and on his face, so quiet that you could almost miss it, was the very beginning of a look I would come to recognize over the following weeks. It was not anger. It was not fear. It was the particular expression of a man who has just been handed something, turned it over in his hands, and noticed a flaw that the person who handed it to him has not yet seen. It was the beginning of a grin. And I remember thinking, in that moment, watching humanity's first conversation with a civilization 8,000 years older than us, that the council representative seemed very confident, very practiced, very sure of what would happen next. I remember thinking that confidence, in my experience, was often the last thing a person had before the situation changed entirely. I reached over and turned up the volume on the feed, because I did not want to miss a single word. None of us did. The document that arrived was called the Compact of Integration, and it was, by any measure, a masterpiece of polite suffocation. I read it 3 times. The first time, I read it the way you read something new, taking in the shape of the words, following the structure, letting the meaning settle. The second time, I read it more carefully, slower, the way you read a contract when you have learned from experience that contracts are where the dangerous ideas hide. The third time, I read it the way you read something when you already know something is wrong but you have not yet found the exact sentence where the wrong thing lives. It took 14 pages. Clause 4 said that member species agreed to maintain military forces only at levels approved by the Council's Security Commission. Clause 9 said that economic agreements with non-member entities required Council ratification. Clause 17 said that territorial expansion, meaning colonization, meaning new settlements, meaning the thing humanity had been doing for 3 generations now, spreading outward into the dark because that is what we do, required Council authorization on a case-by-case basis. Clause 22 established that disputes between member species would be resolved by Council arbitration, with Council rulings binding and final. And then, buried in Clause 31, subsection B, in language so careful it was almost elegant, was the piece that made the other pieces make sense. It said that member species agreed to recognize the Council's role as the primary governing authority for all spacefaring activity within the jurisdiction of the Compact, which was defined, in Appendix C, as the entire mapped galaxy and all systems within reasonable projection distance of its edge. I sat with that for a while. Colin Farrer and his team were in meetings with the Council representative, whose name translated roughly as Veth Karan, for most of that first day. Dr. Osei came back to the Lena Gray in the evening, sat down at the small table in my galley with a cup of the coffee I had lent her the maker for, and looked at the wall for a long moment before she spoke. "He is not unkind," she said. "Veth Karan. He genuinely believes this is good for us. He has done this 46 times. Every species he has done it with is still alive, still functioning, still part of the community. He thinks he is offering us safety." "What is he actually offering us?" I asked. She looked at her cup. "A very comfortable cage," she said. I nodded. I had thought something similar. "The other 46 species signed?" I asked. "Every one," she said. "Some took longer than others, but every one eventually signed." "Why?" She was quiet for a moment. "Because the Council is old and powerful, and because refusing seemed more frightening than accepting, and because every species that refused was shown, very politely, very gently, exactly what refusing would mean." She paused. "Not threatened, shown. There is a difference, apparently. The Council is careful about that." I thought about that difference. I thought about what it would mean to be shown something, rather than threatened with it. The result was the same, but the feeling was different. Threats made you angry. Being shown things made you feel small. I did not like the feeling of being made small. Admiral Escobar called a meeting that evening on the Accord's edge. All senior staff, all diplomatic team members, Dr. Osei, and me, because I was apparently useful to have in the room in the way that cargo haulers sometimes are. We see the weight of things differently than people who have been thinking in abstractions. He stood at the head of the table, the compact document on the display behind him, and he looked around at everyone assembled and said, "Tell me what you see." What followed was 2 hours of careful, thorough, sometimes heated analysis. The diplomats talked about precedent and leverage. The military observers talked about capacity and timelines. Dr. Osei talked about language, about what the choice of words in each clause revealed about how the council thought about power. I listened, and I read the document again on the tablet in front of me, and I kept coming back to Clause 31, subsection B. At the end of 2 hours, Admiral Escobar asked for quiet. "Here is my assessment," he said. "The compact is not written to harm us. It is written by a body that has done this 46 times and found a formula that works. It is efficient. It is thorough. It is also written by people who have never met anything quite like us. And I think that is the thing they do not yet understand about their own document." Colin Farrer, the lead diplomat, frowned. "What do you mean?" Escobar picked up his copy of the compact. He held it for a moment. Then he set it down, very carefully, and he looked at Colin Farrer, and he looked at Dr. Osei, and then he looked at me for a moment before looking at the room at large. "What I mean," he said, "is that this document was written for species who think the way the Council thinks. Hierarchically, collectively, with clear chains of authority and clear definitions of who represents whom." He paused. "They have never had to write a document for a species where the fundamental unit of political will is the individual, where 40 billion people each have an opinion, and half of them will express that opinion loudly, and a significant percentage will find the most creative possible interpretation of any rule you write." The room was quiet. "They have never dealt with lawyers," said Owen Lark from the back of the room, which was the longest sentence I had heard him say in 3 years of working together. Several people laughed, then stopped laughing, because it was also true. "They have never dealt with our lawyers," Escobar said. "They have never dealt with our historians, or our political scientists, or our philosophers, or our engineers, who have a habit of finding out what a thing is for, and then figuring out 17 other uses for it. They have never dealt with a species that has argued about governance for 6,000 years and is still arguing about it." He picked up the document again. "This compact was built on the assumption that when you offer order to a species that has known chaos, they will choose order." He set the document down again. "They don't know us very well," he said. "I thought about that on the way back to the Lena Gray. Owen walked with me, and for a while neither of us said anything. The stars were visible through the corridor windows of the docking station, hard and clear and impossibly distant. And I thought about what it meant that somewhere among them, 46 species had been handed this document and signed it. I thought about what they had felt, reading Clause 31, subsection B, whether they had felt what I felt reading it. That particular tightening in the chest that comes from understanding you are being offered something that looks like a gift but functions like a wall. Do you think we can do anything?" I asked Owen. He thought about it for a while. That was his way. He never answered a question until he had actually thought about it, which was something I respected about him. "I think," he said finally, "that the Council made a mistake." "What mistake?" "They read our history to know we were ready to be found. They didn't read it to understand what they were finding." He paused. "If they had, they would have written a longer document." He went to his cabin. I stood at the window for a while longer, looking at the dark. The next morning, Veth Karan requested a formal meeting with the full diplomatic team to receive our initial response to the compact. He had been gracious about the timeline. He had said we could take the 72 hours he had mentioned in the original transmission. He seemed to expect that we would use most of it for discussion, and arrive at the meeting with carefully worded concerns that he could address, one by one, with the practiced patience of someone who had addressed the same concerns 46 times before. We arrived with something else. I was not in the room when Colin Farrer delivered it. I was on the Lena Gray, watching the feed, but I could see Veth Karan's translator unit working very hard to process what it was receiving, the small light on it cycling rapidly the way it did when the input was coming in faster than the processing could manage. What Colin Farrer had delivered was not a rejection. It was not a demand. It was a list of questions. Specific, detailed, legally precise questions, each one targeting a different assumption embedded in the compact's language. How exactly was the Council's jurisdiction defined in systems that had been colonized before the compact's existence? What constituted reasonable projection distance, as described in Appendix C, and who held the authority to measure it? In Clause 4, what were the precise criteria the Security Commission used to determine approved military levels, and was that criteria document available for review? There were 47 questions in total. Veth Karan looked at the document for a long time. Then he looked at Colin Farrer. Then he said, in his careful, almost human voice, "These are procedural questions." "Yes," said Colin Farrer pleasantly. "We want to make sure we fully understand what we are signing." The other member species did not require this level of clarification. "We appreciate that," said Colin Farrer. "We would still like clarification." There was a pause. Veth Karan consulted something, quietly, away from the translator, and then looked back at the diplomatic team. "We will respond to your questions," he said. "This will take additional time." "We understand," said Colin Farrer. "We are grateful for your patience." Back on the Lena Gray, Nina was watching the feed beside me, her chin in her hands. "He's stalling," she said. "He's buying time," I said. "There's a difference." "What's the difference?" I thought about it. Stalling is what you do when you don't have a plan. Buying time is what you do when you're building one. I looked at the screen, at Veth Karan's patient, ancient face, at Colin Farrer's pleasant, immovable expression. Farrer has a plan. Escobar has a plan. Somewhere on that diplomatic ship, a team of people has been working through the night on a plan. "What kind of plan?" she asked. I picked up my copy of the compact, the one I had been reading and marking for the past day, the one where I had underlined Clause 31, subsection B, and written a small note next to it that said, "Who exactly is humanity in this document?" "The interesting kind," I said. Because here was the thing about the compact that I kept turning over in my mind. The thing that was either nothing or was everything, depending on how you looked at it. The compact referred, consistently, to humanity as the signatory. Not to the United Earth government, not to the fleet, not to any specific body or representative institution. It said humanity agrees. It said humanity acknowledges. It said humanity commits. Humanity. Which raised a question. Which particular 40 billion people had they written a document for? I read Clause 31 again. I looked out at the stars. I thought about Owen saying that the Council had not read our history carefully enough. And I thought about what our history actually contained, what a genuinely thorough reading of it would teach you about the species that had produced it. It would teach you that we had never, not once, not in 6,000 years of recorded civilization, successfully agreed on who spoke for all of us. It would teach you that the word humanity was the most contested word in any document that had ever contained it. And it would teach you that when you handed us a document and pointed to the word humanity and said, "Sign here," you had just opened a question that we had been debating for the entirety of our existence. The Council had 47 questions waiting for answers. I had a feeling, sitting on the Lena Gray with the compact in my hands and the stars outside the window, that the Council was about to have a great many more. 48 hours after Veth Karan received the 47 questions, the Council's response arrived. It was thorough, precisely written, and completely confident. They had answered every question. They had provided clarifying documents, reference texts, historical precedent from the integration of other species. The response was 412 pages long. Colin Farrer read all 412 pages. So did his team. So, I suspected, did a much larger group of people on Earth who had been feeding information and analysis to the diplomatic team around the clock since the moment the compact was received. What came back from that reading was not a second set of questions. It was 3 sentences. I saw the text before it was transmitted, because Admiral Escobar read it to me himself, sitting in the cockpit of the Lena Gray with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, his voice the same steady flat instrument it always was, and I watched his face as he read it. The 3 sentences were, "We have reviewed the compact in full, and find that we require 2 weeks to prepare our formal response. We appreciate the Council's patience and look forward to productive dialogue. Please consider this message our acknowledgement of receipt." That was it. Escobar set the document down. He picked up his coffee. He drank it cold without appearing to notice. Then he looked at me with that expression, the one that had started as the very beginning of a grin and had been quietly growing ever since. 2 weeks, I said. 2 weeks, he confirmed. For what? For the most creative piece of legal engineering in the history of our species, he said, without any drama, the way you say something that is simply true. I sat with that for a moment. Are you going to tell me what it is? I'm going to let you figure it out, he said, because in about 12 days, Beth Karan is going to ask me to explain it, and I want to be able to tell him that even a cargo hauler understood it. Because if a cargo hauler can understand it, it means it is not complicated. It just means nobody has ever thought to do it before. He left. I sat in the cockpit for a long time. I read the compact again. I read Clause 31 again. I read the definition of humanity, as used in the document, which was, as it had always been, entirely unspecified, because the Council had assumed that humanity had a clear central authority that spoke for all of it, the same way every other species in the compact had a clear central authority, because every other species had developed one before leaving their home system, which was apparently something that happened naturally in the process of organizing a civilization for space travel. Every other species. Not us. We had left for space still arguing about who was in charge. We were still arguing about it. We would probably always be arguing about it, because arguing was something we were genuinely good at and had no intention of stopping. I thought about Clause 9. Economic agreements with non-member entities required Council ratification. I thought about Clause 4. Military forces at levels approved by the Security Commission. I thought about Clause 17. Territorial expansion requiring Council authorization on a case-by-case basis. I thought about who, exactly, the Council expected to enforce those clauses. What body? What authority? What specific human institution was going to receive those instructions and distribute them to 40 billion people? And then I thought about what the word sovereignty meant, where it began, what its smallest possible unit was. I sat very still for a moment. Then I went to find Dr. Osei. She was in her borrowed cabin, surrounded by printed copies of the compact and the Council's response documents, with 3 different translation programs running simultaneously on her screen. She looked up when I knocked on the door frame. "How is your international law?" I asked. She tilted her head. "Functional. Why?" "In legal terms," I said carefully, "what is the smallest unit of sovereignty that is legally recognized?" She looked at me for a long moment. Something shifted in her expression. Not surprise exactly, but the look of someone who has been thinking along the same corridor and has just heard a door open at the end of it. "Theoretically," she said slowly, "sovereignty can rest with an individual. In certain legal traditions, the individual is the foundational unit of political authority. All larger bodies derive their authority upward from the individual, not downward from the state. And in the context of the compact," I said, "if humanity signed as 40 billion individual sovereignties rather than as a single collective entity, then every clause that refers to humanity as a unified body," she said, "would need to be renegotiated with every individual signatory separately." We looked at each other. "That's what they're doing," I said. "I think so," she said. "Is it legal?" She was quiet for a moment. "Within their own compact's framework," she said. "I think it might be. The document never specifies the form of the signatory, and it just says humanity. And if humanity is 40 billion sovereign individuals rather than one collective unit, then there are 40 billion signatories," I said. "Each with the right to file individual amendments," she said. "Each with a vote in council proceedings. Each constituting a separate legal entity under the compact's own definitions." I let that settle for a moment. "That is," I said, "either the most brilliant thing I have ever heard of, or the most chaotic." "With us," she said, "those are usually the same thing." The 2 weeks passed faster than I expected, probably because every day brought new information, new analysis, new fragments of what was being assembled on Earth, and on every major colony and station in the human network. People were filing paperwork. That was the simplest way to describe it. Ordinary people, Lawyers and engineers and farmers and teachers and cargo haulers like me were filing paperwork. Each one was registering, under the framework of the compact's own definitions, as an individual sovereign entity. Each one was including a personal amendment to the compact that specified their individual terms of integration. The amendments were varied. Some were serious, some were philosophical, some were the kind of amendments that only make sense if you understand that the person filing them has spent 3 weeks reading every word of a 400-page legal document and has found several things they personally object to and one thing they find genuinely funny. One woman from New Zealand filed an amendment requiring the council to acknowledge her right to keep chickens without regulatory oversight from any non-Earth body. It went into the queue with everything else. Every amendment went into the queue. On the 14th day, the formal response was transmitted to the council. I was watching Veth Karan's face on the feed when the transmission came through. He looked at his communications officer. He looked at his translator unit. He looked at the count on his display that was updating, still counting, still not finished. "This is," he said, in his careful, almost human voice, "a very large transmission." "Yes," said Colin Farrer pleasantly. "It continues to arrive. Yes, there is quite a lot of it. How many individual documents are included in this transmission?" Colin Farrer smiled. "As of the last count before we transmitted," he said, "approximately 40,217,481,000, and some additional number that was still growing when we sent." Veth Karan's translator unit emitted a sound that its designers had probably not intended it to make. "Each document," said Colin Farrer, in the same pleasant tone he had maintained throughout every conversation, "is a formal declaration of individual sovereignty under the terms of your own compact's definitional framework, accompanied by a personal amendment from each signatory. We understand this creates some additional processing requirements. We are happy to extend the same patience you have extended to us." Veth Karan looked at the transmission count. It was still updating. It was at this point, watching on the Lena Gray's feed, that I noticed Admiral Escobar, standing at the back of the diplomatic room, had allowed himself, fully, for the first time since all of this began, to complete the grin that had been building on his face for 2 weeks. It was not a small grin. It was not a polite grin. It was the grin of a man whose species had just done something that had never been done in 8,000 years of galactic legal history, and done it using nothing but the other side's own paperwork. "We are pleased," said Colin Farrer, "to be member 47. Veth Karan looked at him for a very long moment. "You are not," he said finally, "what we expected." "No," said Colin Farrer, "we rarely are." The legal processing queue broke first. It did not break dramatically. There was no crash, no alarm, no moment of visible failure. It simply stopped updating at approximately 40,300,000,000, and a number that nobody had caught precisely because the counter had frozen in the middle of updating. Veth Karan's communications team spent 6 hours attempting to resolve the issue before acknowledging, with visible discomfort, that their system had not been designed to handle this particular volume of individual filings. This was, I would later learn, the most polite way to describe what had actually happened, which was that the Council's legal infrastructure, built over 8,000 years to process the sovereign decisions of collective entities with clear governing bodies and centralized authority, had encountered humanity's 40 billion individual amendments and simply had no framework for what to do with them. It was not that the system rejected the filings, it was that the system had accepted them, every one, and was now required to process each one individually, and the queue at its current processing speed would take approximately 900 years to clear. I found this out from Dr. Osei, who had found it out from a council communications officer, who had told her in confidence, and with what she described as the air of a person who genuinely needed to tell someone. 900 years, I said. At current processing speeds, she said. Can they increase the speed? They're working on it, but the issue isn't speed exactly. The issue is that each filing requires individual acknowledgement under their own compact rules. They built the rule. They can't exempt themselves from it. She paused. Every one of our 40 billion signatories is now, under the compact's own terms, a recognized individual member entity. Each one has the right to be heard. Each one has filed an amendment. The Council is legally obligated to address each amendment. I thought about that. So they can't just ignore us, I said. They never could. But now they also can't just process us as a single block. We're not one voice. We're 40 billion voices, each one speaking at exactly the same volume, and their entire system was designed for one voice per species. Admiral Escobar had not slept properly in 4 days, but he looked more alert than anyone I had seen who had slept well. He was running on something that was not coffee, though he was drinking plenty of that too. He was in the diplomatic room for most of every day, in contact with Earth, with the colonies, with legal teams on 14 different stations, who had been working on the second phase of the strategy. The second phase was simpler to understand but more complex to execute. If each individual human was now a recognized entity under the compact, then each individual human had, technically, a seat at the table for any council vote that affected them. The compact's voting framework was designed for 47 member species, each with a single representative casting a weighted vote. It was not designed for 47 member species and 40 billion individual human entities, each with their own vote. The math did not work in the Council's favor. Veth Karan requested an emergency consultation on the 5th day after the filing. He was still gracious. He was still patient. He was still precisely the careful, practiced representative of an 8,000-year-old institution that had integrated 46 species without incident. But there was something different in how he held himself now. Not anger, not quite frustration. Something closer to the expression of a person who has opened a door expecting a small room and found that it opened onto a very large and complicated landscape that extends much further than anticipated. Colin Farrer met with him. I watched the feed. "We need to discuss the nature of your filing," Veth Karan said. "Of course," said Colin Farrer. "The compact was intended to be signed by humanity, as a collective entity. Your own governmental structures exist. Your own representative bodies function. The United Earth Government is a recognized authority. The fleet has a command structure. These are the bodies we expected to engage with." "They did engage with you," said Colin Farrer, "and they also represent the will of the individual humans who constitute them. Our governance structures are representative, not sovereign. The sovereignty rests with the individual citizens. Our representative bodies act on behalf of those individuals, but they do not replace them." Veth Karan was quiet for a moment. "No other species has made this distinction." "That may be," said Colin Farrer, "because no other species has the same relationship between individual and collective authority that we do. We have been debating this internally for 6,000 years. We have not resolved it. We may never resolve it. It is, in many ways, the central argument of our entire civilization." Another pause. "You are saying," said Veth Karan slowly, "that your civilization's governing philosophy is built on an unresolved question." "Yes," said Colin Farrer. "We find it more productive that way." Back on the Lena Gray, Nina laughed for a long time at that. Pete made more coffee. Owen, at his station, allowed himself a small smile that was enormous by his standards. What none of us saw coming, and what became clear in the days that followed, was that the cracks in the Council's confidence would not only come from the difficulty of processing 40 billion filings, they would come from inside the Council itself. It started with the Grell. The Grell were a species I had not known existed until 3 weeks ago, which described my knowledge of most of the Council's member species. They were one of the older members, one of the first 10 species to join the original compact 8,000 years ago. Their representative reached out not through official Council channels but directly to Dr. Osei, in a private transmission that Dr. Osei brought to me and Admiral Escobar with an expression that suggested she had not entirely expected to be delivering this particular message. The Grell representative, whose name I could not pronounce but who asked to be called by the closest human approximation, which was something like Brennan, said that the Grell had watched our filing with considerable interest. He said that certain aspects of our approach raised questions that the Grell had not previously thought to ask. He said that the Grell had joined the compact in its early years, before the current framework had fully developed, and that some of the clauses we had filed amendments against were clauses the Grell had accepted without fully understanding the long-term implications. He said, "We did not know you could refuse." I was present for that transmission. I heard those words directly, and I thought about what it meant that a species 8,000 years old, a species that had been a founding member of the Galactic Council, had watched us for 3 weeks and found something in what we were doing that they had not previously thought was possible. Not the legal strategy, not the specific filing, the underlying thing, the refusal, the simple, quiet, utterly human act of reading something handed to you with the expectation of compliance and saying, "No, actually, let me read this more carefully first." "We did not know you could refuse," Brennan said again. "We did not know either," I said, "until we tried." He was quiet for a moment on the transmission. Then he said, "We would like to speak with your admiral." The meeting between Admiral Escobar and Brennan of the Grell lasted 4 hours. I was not in that meeting. But what came out of it, and what began to ripple through the Council's diplomatic channels over the following days, was the beginning of something that nobody had planned for. Not us, not the Council, possibly not anyone in 8,000 years of galactic civilization. Other species were paying attention. Not all of them, not most of them, not yet, but 3, then 5, then 9 of the Council's 46 member species reached out through back channels, through Dr. Osei, through Colin Farrer, through a network of conversations that built slowly, and then quickly, the way things build when the first person says something that other people have been waiting to hear. They had signed the compact. They had agreed to the terms. They had done what every species in the Council had done, accepted the framework of integration, the hierarchy of authority, the smooth machinery of a system that was old and powerful, and had never been seriously questioned. But questioned did not mean impossible. None of them had known you could refuse. None of them had thought to look for the loopholes in a document that had been presented as a completed fact. None of them had 40 billion citizens each with their own opinion and a cultural tradition of expressing it loudly and in writing. We had done something they had not thought to do. And now they were watching to see what happened next. Admiral Escobar came to find me on the 8th day after the filing. He sat down in the co-pilot seat and looked at the stars for a while without speaking, which was unusual for him. "How many are talking to us now?" I asked. 11, he said. 12 if you count the Yennethi, and I am not sure whether to count them because their situation is complicated. "Are they the ones with the—" "Yes," he said. "Anyway, 12. "Out of 46, I said. "For now," he said. He looked at the stars. "The Council is going to push back. They have to. This is their entire system we are bending. They will not bend it quietly." He paused. "I expect we will see something more direct in the next few days." He was right. On the 10th day, the Council transmitted a formal legal opinion from its arbitration body, stating that the individual human filings were not valid under the Compact's established framework and would not be processed as individual sovereignties. The opinion cited precedent, historical practice, and the intent of the Compact's original drafters. It was thorough, confident, and written in the tone of something that expected to be the final word on the matter. Colin Farrer's response arrived within 6 hours. I read it on the Lena Gray. It was 37 pages long, and it dismantled the Council's opinion clause by clause, citing the Council's own documents, their own precedents, their own historical record. It found 3 cases in Council history where individual filings had been accepted from non-collective entities. It found 2 cases where the definition of member species had been interpreted more broadly than the default. It cited, most devastating of all, a section of the Compact's own founding document that stated clearly that the Compact derived its authority from the consent of those it governed, and that consent, by definition, had to be individual. It ended with one sentence. "We look forward to the Council's reconsideration." Veth Karan did not respond for 2 days. When he did, it was not through official channels. He requested a private meeting with Admiral Escobar, just the 2 of them, without diplomatic teams or legal observers or translators beyond the basic unit they both wore. I do not know everything that was said in that meeting. Escobar told me some of it afterward, sitting in the cockpit of the Lena Gray with the stars outside and the coffee long since cold. What he told me was this. Veth Karan had done this 46 times. He had integrated 46 species into the Compact. He believed in the Compact. He believed it was genuinely better for every species that joined it, that the stability and community it offered was worth the constraints it imposed, that the other 46 species were, by every measure he had, better off than they had been before joining. He was not wrong about that, Escobar said. He was genuinely not wrong. But he had made an assumption. He had assumed that what humanity needed was the same as what every other species needed, that our chaos was a problem to be solved by the order the compact could offer, that if he gave us the same framework he had given 46 others, we would fit into it the same way. He had not understood that our chaos was not a problem. It was a feature. "What did you tell him?" I asked. Escobar was quiet for a moment. "I told him," he said, "that we were not trying to destroy the council. We were not trying to leave the community. We wanted to be part of it. We just needed it to be a community rather than a hierarchy. And I told him that the 12 species currently talking to us felt the same way, and that the number would grow." He looked at his cold coffee. "And then I told him something else," he said. "What?" "I told him that in the history of our species, every time someone has tried to put us in a box, we have found a way out of it. Not because we are aggressive, not because we are ungovernable, but because we are constitutionally, fundamentally, at the most basic level of what we are, unable to stop asking why the box has to be that shape." He paused, and I told him that this was not a problem the compact was going to solve. It was a quality he was going to have to learn to work with. I looked at the stars. What did he say to that? Escobar picked up his coffee, realized it was cold, set it down. He said, Escobar told me, that this was going to require a much longer conversation. And I said we had plenty of time. And then I grinned. He glanced at me. He asked what the grin meant. I told him it meant we were enjoying ourselves. He paused. I think that frightened him more than anything else we had done. Outside, the stars were exactly where they had always been. The council's ship was still there, large and dark and patient. But something had shifted, some invisible thing in the arrangement of it all, and what it felt like, sitting in the cockpit of the Lena Gray with my cold coffee and my grease-stained hands, and 11 years of flying cargo through the dark, was the particular feeling of a door that has been assumed to be permanently closed, and has just, very quietly, begun to open. The council called it a recess. Veth Karan announced it formally, through official channels, with language that was careful to describe it not as a pause or a retreat, but as a period of procedural reflection necessary for proper institutional consideration of the unprecedented circumstances arising from humanity's integration process. It was a masterpiece of saying nothing had gone wrong while making clear that something had gone very differently than expected. The recess lasted 3 weeks. In those 3 weeks, more happened than in the entire month before them. The number of council member species in back-channel communication with Admiral Escobar's team grew from 12 to 19, then to 23. The conversations were careful, quiet, nothing official, nothing that could be cited in formal proceedings. But the pattern was clear. Species who had signed the compact years or decades or centuries ago were, for the first time, asking questions about it, not rejecting it, not rebelling against it, just asking questions. The same kind of questions, it turned out, that our 47 questions had started with. How exactly is this defined? Who holds the authority to measure it? What criteria are used? And is that document available for review? Veth Karan knew what was happening. He was not unintelligent. He had spent a very long time doing this, and he recognized the shape of what was unfolding, even if the specific form of it was new. He came to the Lena Gray, not to the Accord's edge, not to a diplomatic meeting room. He came, in a small shuttle, to my cargo hauler, and he asked, through Dr. Osei, who came with him as translator, if he could speak with me. I had no idea why he wanted to speak with me specifically. I asked Dr. Osei afterward, and she said that Veth Karan had studied the human crew assignments for all vessels at the meeting site, and had noted that I had no diplomatic role, no military rank, and no official function in the proceedings whatsoever, and had concluded that this made me the most useful person to talk to. I found that either flattering or insulting, and I could not decide which. He came into the galley. He sat down, which required some adjustment given his height, and he looked at the table for a moment, And then he looked at me. "You are a transport operator," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," I said. "You have no role in the formal proceedings." "Correct." "Then why are you here?" "I was the closest ship when your first transmission arrived. Admiral Escobar asked me to stay. Nobody has told me to leave." He was quiet for a moment. Something in his manner was different from the formal meetings, from the diplomatic transmissions. He seemed, for the first time since his arrival, like a person rather than a representative. "I would like to understand something," he said. "All right. Every species we have integrated has had a period of resistance. Some longer, some shorter. Some expressed concerns, some made requests. Some required additional reassurances. But everyone eventually arrived at acceptance. They understood what we were offering. They understood the value of being part of something larger." He paused. "You understand this too. I know you do. Your diplomats know it. Your admiral knows it. What we are offering is real. The stability, the community, the accumulated knowledge of 47 civilizations working together. It is genuinely valuable." "It is," I said. "Nobody disputes that." "Then why?" He looked at me directly. "Why is this so difficult? What is it that you cannot simply accept?" I thought about how to answer that. I looked at my hands on the table. I looked at the coffee maker that Dr. Osei had borrowed and returned. "Can I ask you something first?" I said. "Yes." "The other 46 species, when they signed, were they happy?" He considered this carefully. "Happy is not a universal concept," he said. "But they were stable. They were integrated. They were part of something that benefited them." "Were they happy?" I asked again. Another pause. "Some were content," he said. "Some had reservations that faded with time. Some found the process difficult initially. Did any of them feel that they had given something up?" He looked at me for a long moment. "Some, yes. The cost of integration is always the acceptance of certain constraints. What did they give up?" He was quiet. "Veth Karan," I said. "I am not a diplomat. I am not going to use anything you say in a formal proceeding. I am asking you as a person who has watched what you have built for 8,000 years, and who is trying to understand something." He looked at his hands, which were different from mine in ways I could see, and probably in ways I could not. "They gave up," he said finally, "a degree of self-determination. Yes, that is the honest answer. They gained stability, community, protection, access to accumulated knowledge. They gave up some degree of the freedom to make choices that affected only themselves." "We cannot do that," I said. "You have not tried." "I know." I looked at him. "But I know us. And I know that asking 40 billion humans to hand their self-determination to an external authority, even a benevolent one, even one with 8,000 years of evidence that it works, is asking something that we will spend the next 8,000 years fighting about internally. Not because we reject the community, because we cannot agree to hand anyone power over us. It is not stubbornness. It is not arrogance. It is the thing at the center of us." I paused. "We have been arguing about it since before we could write. We will be arguing about it after we are gone. It is what we are." He looked at me for a long time. "Then what do you want?" he asked. "What does humanity want? That is not the compact as written." "We want to be part of the community," I said. "We want the connection, the shared knowledge, the protection of something larger than ourselves. We want all of it." I paused. "We just need it to be ours as much as it is yours. Not a framework we are integrated into. A thing we help build." He was quiet for a long time. "The compact is not designed for that," he said. "I know," I said. "That's why we are going to have to write something new." He looked at me. Something in his face shifted, the careful professional layer of it, and what was underneath was not anger or frustration, but something closer to exhaustion, and underneath that, something that might have been, in another kind of face, something like recognition. "Is that what your admiral has been working on?" he asked. "I think so," I said. "And the species speaking to you, the 19, the 23. They have questions," I said. "The same questions we had. Questions they never thought to ask before because no one had thought to ask them." I looked at him. "Veth Karan, what you built is 8,000 years old. That is extraordinary. But things that are 8,000 years old sometimes need to be rebuilt." He was very still. "That is," he said slowly, "a very large thing to say." "Yes," I said, "but I think you already know it is true." He left without answering, but he left differently than he had arrived. And 3 days later, for the first time in 8,000 years of galactic history, the Galactic Council's formal session was called, not to issue orders, not to process an integration, but to discuss a motion introduced not by a council member, but by a collective of 26 species, 19 of them existing members of the Compact, who wanted to talk about what the council was and what it could be. The motion was titled, "Toward a Renewed Framework." Humanity co-authored it. Admiral Escobar transmitted it through Colin Farrer, and I watched it go on the Lena Gray's display, and I thought about 47 questions, and 3 sentences, and 40 billion filings, and a conversation in a galley with cold coffee, and a borrowed coffee maker. I thought about what Owen had said, that the council had read our history but had not understood what they were reading. And I thought that was the thing about us, the thing that was hardest to explain to someone from the outside. Our history was not a record of orderly progress toward a reasonable outcome. Our history was a record of chaos and argument, and failure and stubbornness, and the particular kind of creativity that only comes from people who have been told something cannot be done, and have decided that this is interesting information but not a final answer. We were difficult. We were complicated. We were constitutionally incapable of accepting the first version of anything handed to us without looking for the places where it could be better. We were also, I thought, exactly what the council had needed for 8,000 years without knowing it. 3 months after the first transmission, in a meeting room aboard a council station that had not hosted anything like this in its entire history, 29 species sat at a table, and the conversation that had been building since the moment Veth Karan's ship appeared at the coordinates began its final movement. I was not in that room. I was, as I had been for most of this, on the Lena Gray, watching on the feed, with Owen at his station, and Nina narrating quietly beside me, and Pete making coffee in the back. I was exactly where I had been when all of this started, the closest human ship to the situation, present by accident, watching something enormous happen because it happened to be within range of my scanner. The document that came out of that meeting was called the Galactic Accord. It was 11,432 pages long. Every species at the table had contributed sections. Every major legal tradition represented among the 29 species had been incorporated. It was, by any measure, the most complex collaborative document in the history of documented spacefaring civilization. Humanity wrote 2,070 pages of it. The Accord did not have a supreme authority. It did not have a ratification body that could override member decisions. It did not have a territorial clause. It did not have anything equivalent to Clause 31, subsection B of the original compact. What it had, instead, was a framework for cooperation, for shared decision-making, for the resolution of disputes through a process that no single body could control or override, because the process itself was distributed across all member species simultaneously. It was, essentially, the most complicated argument in the history of the galaxy, formalized. We loved it immediately. Veth Karan presented it to the remaining 17 council members who had not been part of the working group. That meeting was separate, private, and I did not have a feed to it. But Dr. Osei was present, and she described it to me afterward, sitting in the galley of the Lena Gray with yet another cup of coffee. She said that Veth Karan had presented the Accord carefully, methodically, going through each section and explaining what it replaced and why. She said that some council members were skeptical, some were resistant, and some were, in the way of people encountering something genuinely new, simply very quiet. She said that at one point, one of the older council members, a species that had been part of the original compact for nearly the full 8,000 years, asked Veth Karan why he was proposing this, why he, of all council representatives, was standing in front of them recommending a change to the framework that had defined the council's existence since before most of the current member species existed. She said Veth Karan was quiet for a moment, and then he said something that she told me she would not forget for the rest of her life. He said, "Because a cargo hauler asked me a question I could not answer." I read the Accord in full. It took me 4 days. I read every section, including the 2,070 pages that humanity had contributed, and I found in it the same quality that ran through everything we had done in the months since the first transmission. The quality of people who are not trying to win, but are genuinely trying to build something that works, and who know from long experience that anything worth building takes longer to build than you expected and comes out differently than you planned. The accord passed, not unanimously. 12 of the 17 remaining council members ratified it within the first week. 4 ratified it over the following month. The last one, a species I will not name because their internal politics were their own business, ratified it quietly, at the end of a session that lasted 2 days, with no formal announcement. The original compact was formally dissolved on a Tuesday. I was doing maintenance on the coolant relay again when it happened, because the relay had been giving me trouble since the start of all this, and I had not had a proper chance to fix it. Owen told me over the intercom. He said, "It's done," in his way, without elaboration, and I put down the maintenance tool and sat there in the access shaft for a minute, looking at the inside of the relay panel. Then I finished the repair, because the relay still needed fixing. Colin Farrer called me afterward. He thanked me, which I found strange, because I had not done anything except fly my ship to a set of coordinates and watch what happened. I told him that, and he said, "You talked to Veth Karan." I said that I had talked to him in my galley over coffee, and I did not think that counted as a formal contribution to galactic history. Farrer said, "It counts." He sounded like he meant it. Admiral Escobar called me too. He did not say much. He asked if the coolant relay was fixed. I said almost. He said good, because there was a cargo run waiting, and the universe did not pause for history. He was right about that. The Lena Gray left the coordinates 3 days later, carrying a shipment of hydroponics equipment to a colony station, 2 systems out. Nina plotted the course. Pete loaded the cargo. Owen ran the pre-departure checks. I sat in the pilot's seat and looked at the display, at the coordinates that had been, for months, the center of everything, now just an empty point in space. The Council's ship was gone. Veth Karan had returned to Council space, to the work of explaining the accord to the 29 member species, to the long process of implementing something that had never existed before. He had shaken Admiral Escobar's hand before departing, which was a gesture he had apparently researched specifically, and he had looked at Escobar for a long moment and said, "This will be difficult." Escobar had said, "Everything worth doing is." And then, because he was Escobar, he had grinned. I fired up the engines and turned the Lena Gray toward the transit point. The stars shifted slightly as the ship moved, the way they always do, the way they have always done, whether or not humanity is in the middle of changing the structure of galactic civilization. Nina was quiet for once. Owen was at his station. Pete had made coffee, which was on the console beside me, and I picked it up and drank it, and it was, for once, the right temperature. I thought about Veth Karan asking me what humanity wanted. I thought about my answer. I thought about whether it had been the right answer, or just the truest answer, and whether those were the same thing. I thought about 47 questions, and 3 sentences, and 40 billion filings, and a borrowed coffee maker, and a grin in a cockpit, and a woman from New Zealand who had filed an amendment about chickens, which was, as it happened, included in the Accord's Appendix on Individual Rights, Clause 12, which stated that no member entity's domestic practices could be regulated by any body external to their own governance framework, without explicit invitation. She would never know that, but it was there. The transit point was 20 minutes ahead. I set the ship to cruise and leaned back in the seat and looked at the stars. They were exactly where they had always been, every one of them. Exactly where they had been before the first transmission, before the compact, before the accord, before any of it. Stars did not care about galactic councils or legal frameworks, or the particular chaos of one species finding loopholes in other people's paperwork. But they looked different to me now. Not smaller, not larger, just different in the way that things look when you know more about them, when the dark between them has been filled in a little, when you understand that the lights are not just lights but places, and that in some of those places, right now, a species that had never thought to ask a question was asking it for the first time, because someone had shown them that you could. I picked up my coffee. I drank it. I watched the stars. Somewhere behind me, in the coordinates we had just left, The history of the galaxy had been altered by 40 billion people doing paperwork, a cargo hauler asking questions in a galley, and an admiral with a grin that the council had made the mistake of not understanding until it was far too late. I found I was smiling. Not the enormous grin of triumph, not the careful smile of a diplomat, just the quiet, ordinary smile of a person who has seen something extraordinary happen and knows, for certain, that it is not the last extraordinary thing that will happen. We were number 47. We were not the last word. We were barely the first sentence. But it was our sentence. We had written it ourselves. And as the Lena Gray crossed the transit threshold, and the stars shifted, and the familiar darkness of transit space wrapped around the ship, I thought that this was the thing no one outside of us would ever quite understand, the thing that made us what we were, the thing the council had missed in all their reading of our history. We did not need to be the most powerful. We did not need to be the oldest. We did not need to win. We just needed the door to be open. And if it was not open, we would read the fine print until we found the clause that said it had to be. That was us. That was all of us. That was the 40 billion voices in the queue, each one different, each one loud, each one absolutely certain that they had a right to be heard. That was the grin. And the galaxy, I thought, was only just beginning to understand what it meant.